All right. Welcome, everybody, to the December edition of Jobs to be Done. We are thrilled to have David Duncan with us today. So we're going to have an opportunity to pick his brain and hear all about the great work that he's done with Jobs to be Done. I am Elaine Matthias. I am one of the co-founders of the Jobs to be Done toolkit, along with Jim Callback. Hi, Jim.
Hey, everybody. Jim Callback here.
Welcome. So we're just going to go through, as we usually do, a couple of quick updates to the toolkit, just to let you know what we've got on the horizon, touch base on the agenda, and then we'll dive right in. So as we mentioned, our special guest is David. I've got a couple updates, and then we'll roll into our standard Q&A, which we do, for the last 40 minutes of everything. And we should wrap up between, for my time, 12:45, one-ish, depending on 45 minutes to an hour, depending on where you are. So just really the biggest update is that our job maps from beginning to end course, which we run every 6 to 8 weeks or so. The next edition is February 7th, 9th, and 11th. That's Monday, Wednesday, Friday from 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. We just wrapped up our last edition of the course. It was the first time we had extended it to 2 hours, and it went really, really well. We had tons of time for discussion, tons of time for hands-on activities, and it was just a lot of fun to have that extra 30 minutes to really hear more about what everybody was working on and how they were applying Jobs to be Done in their day-to-day work. Also, the integrating Jobs to be Done into your workflow ebook is out. We launched this maybe 2 months ago, but that's available for download. So Jim and I talk about how you can use Jobs to be Done along with some of the frameworks that you're probably already familiar with and using in your organization: design thinking, agile, lean. And we talk a little bit about some of the weaknesses of those frameworks and how Jobs to be Done can kind of help fill out that space to give you a really well-rounded approach to innovation and customer experience.
Great. So, the majority of this, I'm going to talk to David in a second, but the majority of this is your questions. We do categorize this as a community webinar. It's actually not using the Zoom webinar platform. This is a meeting. So if you want to go ahead and turn your webcams on, your mics will be hot if you want to talk. So please keep them muted if you're not talking. But I'd love to see where folks are from. Scott's here, and Scott's in North Carolina. Hi, Scott. I'm in Jersey City, New Jersey. If you guys want to go to the chat and let us know where you're from, of course, Danny already appended that to his name, so we can see that there. Mel's in Denver, Pasadena, of course, in Germany. Wolfram, welcome back, Wolfram.
Hi, Wolfram.
John's in ex-Boston, now Toronto. Okay.
Costa Rica. That might be a first.
I think that's a first. We've had Costa Rica. That's right, in San Fran area.
Hi, Chaco.
Great. So if you have a question as we're going along, just pop it there into the Zoom chat. Elaine's going to help us wrangle those, and we'll come back. You can ask a question for me, for David, just in general, even questions for other people on the call. We've had folks jump in and answer questions for us from the audience as well, too. Like I said, it's a community event, and we're going to have a big discussion. But super happy to have David Duncan here. David reached out to me on LinkedIn a while back, and I was happy to connect with him. He's, of course, he's a managing director of InnoSight, a company that I point to in my book, particularly some of Scott Anthony's work. And he's a co-author of Competing Against Luck. So he actually collaborated with Clayton Christensen on Competing Against Luck. But as Danny just pointed out, he has a book also called The Secret Lives of Customers. There you go, Danny. Thanks for holding that up there. A little bit of advertisement for you there, David. People get the book. It doesn't have the word Jobs to be Done on the cover, so you might not have found it. It actually took me a while, Scott, same with your book too, that had to kind of get, people had to point me to this book. And I'm into it, David. I have to admit, I haven't completed it, but I'm into it. And so far it's great. And I do want to talk to you about the secret lives of customers. But before we get into that, I just wanted to welcome you to the episode here at Jobs to be Done Untangled, David, and thanks so much for joining us.
Great. Thanks, Jim, for having me. I really appreciate it, and I'm a big fan of yours and your writing and your work and Jobs to be Done. So it's exciting to be here.
Thanks. Yeah, we're trying to keep the conversation going here with this group of enthusiasts. Where are you right now? Actually, you're in a Boston area too, I think, right?
Well, I live in Rhode Island most of the year. Right now I'm in Florida. We're down here for a couple weeks
of
vacation. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks for taking time to join us. I just gave a real brief overview of, the fact that you're managing director of Insight, but could you tell us just a little bit more about, your background and your professional career and your role?
Sure. I've been at Insight for about 16 years. So that's the bulk of my professional career. Insight was started by Clay Christensen about 20 years ago. It's a consulting firm, about 100 people. We work on helping companies create the next version of themselves. I'd say that's the most succinct way to say it. As I'm sure everybody on this call knows, Clay wrote a book called The Innovator's Dilemma 30 years or so ago, which described this universal dilemma big companies face as they get larger and more successful. They get kind of locked into a certain success formula, a certain way of doing things. And when the world around them changes and they need to change, it's very hard for them to evolve into the next, set of businesses that might provide their next tranche of growth. And he called that the innovator's dilemma. Pretty much everything we do is in some way oriented towards helping large organizations crack that dilemma and figure out how they can continue to grow and innovate in spite of it.
Yeah, that's great. And and of course, in the Innovator Solution, chapter 3 of the Innovator Solution is where he first uses the term jobs to be done. And I think most modern approaches to jobs to be done really kind of point back to him as the person who not just coined the term, but kind of solidified that as a concept, particularly in the context of disruption, his definition of the word disruption. And the thing that always attracted me to jobs to be done, coming from human-centered design side of things and innovation side of things, is it is very human-centric. So here you have these top business thinkers and leaders talking about disruption to their businesses, and the core of it, the germ of it, is very, very human-centric. And that's kind of the aspect of jobs to be done that always attracted me to it. And I love it. I love in The Secret Lives of Customers the way you make it very human as well too.
Yeah, it's definitely and I think that's the through line in Clay's research originally was, going from, well, why do companies get disrupted? It's because, when if you think about the life cycle of a company, whenever something starts up in a startup, for it to get any kind of traction in a market, it has to, whether it calls it this or not, it has to be solving some group of customers' jobs to be done, better than any alternative they have. That's why it takes root somewhere. But then as it locks into a certain successful solution and it starts to grow, it starts to do all kinds of things naturally that get it more and more disconnected from, conscious knowledge of what those jobs to be done are. Like it starts to organize around product lines, for example, as a way to be efficient. It starts to try to make those same products ever more and more efficiently. It starts to measure its success by its growth in product sales. It starts to, or how much share of a market as defined by a certain product category it has. And even culturally, it just loses sight of really what's driving people to hire its products in the first place. And that sets it up to be disrupted, right, by another startup that comes along and figures out that the job isn't being met as well anymore.
Right. Yeah. So it's core to that disruption theory. And then, of course, in competing against luck, you along with Karen Dillon and Taddy Hall really expound on that aspect in a lot more detail. And I'd love to just ask you about your involvement in the project and how that came about and what your contribution was.
Sure. Yeah. So, Clay co-founded Innovator. He's somebody that I worked with for, the whole time I was there in some capacity. And he'd always wanted to write a book about jobs to be done. It was a thing that he was aspiring to do for over 10 years. It went through many different series of potential co-authors. And I think it finally landed on this group. And my role was, in the early days of Insight, we didn't have methods for applying jobs to be done. So, we created them. And, I was involved in a lot of the work that we did early on in developing the way Insight goes about applying jobs to be done. And so I was, tapped on the shoulder to help out in the book. And many of the stories in the book of applications of jobs and our clients are things that I worked on. So we would meet every week for a couple hours, twice a week in Clay's office over at the Harvard Business School, and talk about where we wanted to take the book and what stories we wanted to tell, and kind of map it out. And then we got the writing done.
That's great. And of course, he passed away. What was it, last year? Sadly.
Yeah, a little more than a year ago. Yeah.
Was it in 2019, at the end of 2019?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. What kind of person was he? What was he like to work with?
Oh gosh, he was he's one of the best human beings that I've ever met or anticipate meeting. I mean, just beyond his brilliance as a writer and a thinker, he's just a fantastic human being. Really generous, really kind, very humble person. I went to his memorial service that they had in Cambridge, and there must have been over 1,000 people there. And it was 2 hours long, the service, and he has 5 kids, and they each got up and they gave about a 15-minute testimony. Testimony is not the right word. Eulogy, is that the right word? Eulogy, yeah. Or just talking about their dad. And it was riveting, and one of the most moving and beautiful things I've ever seen. Each of his kids giving this 15-minute just beautiful speech that they were funny and moving and sad, and they each reminded me of Clay and his his own ability to just tell stories and to speak in such a moving and clear way. And so I hold that in my mind of if at the end of one's life, I think that's a lot to aspire to, but just you could be that revered by your family and community and friends. That's a great thing to aspire to. And the other thing with Clay is I think one of the reasons his name is associated with some of these ideas like jobs to be done and disruption are not just his own contributions to them, but he's such a great storyteller. He focuses a lot on how to tell stories that are really sticky and interesting and compelling, and he was great at that, both in speaking and writing.
Yeah, and that's probably a good segue over to your book, The Secret Lives of Customers, because it essentially is a story. You wrote it like a novel, like a detective story. Kind of Jobs to Be Done is wrapped inside of this novel. Can you tell us a little bit about that book and why you chose that approach?
Sure. And I don't know how much of this is that interesting to this audience, but when I started working on it, it was really a personal project. I didn't necessarily anticipate it was going to turn out such that anyone would want to read it, let alone publish it. But I'd always wanted to try to write a book on my own, and I started out thinking, well, Competing Against Luck was pretty successful, as any book with Clay's name on it would be, as a presentation of the concept, right? But it didn't really tell you how to do very much, I'd say. And so I started out thinking, well, there needs to be a book about how do you do jobs to be done. And that was before I read your book, Jim, which I think is the best one out there I've seen on how to do jobs to be done. But so that was the initial idea. And I thought, well, but it's really an idea that's not just for specialists. I guess that was the thing I was thinking more than anything was, could you democratize it and make it accessible to everyone? Because it's obviously very useful for innovators and product designers and strategy developers, but even people, everybody else working in an organization. It's a really helpful language for speaking precisely about customers and what they need, and it can be a common shared language in an organization that everybody uses, so they all know what they're talking about when they talk about customer needs. And it's useful in your day job, whatever it is. Everybody has customers in a sense, even people that are in internal roles, right? You've got internal customers, those people whose problems and goals you want to help them with. And so I thought, well, how could you package this set of ideas in a way that would might be more broadly accessible and intriguing? And I remember it was very much inspired by the books of Patrick Lencioni, I think his most famous one is this book called The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, which I read about, 16, 17 years ago. And it's in the same format where they're kind of a short novel designed to teach a set of business ideas. And then at the end, he steps out of the book a little bit to describe the ideas directly, nonfiction. And I remember reading that book in a couple hours. It was really fun, really entertaining. I never looked back at it, but I never forgot what it taught me. Like it was really useful. And so I thought, well, why don't I try that? And it was also, I started out trying to write it in a nonfiction format, and I was just boring myself to death. So I thought, well, I don't have Clay's gift for telling stories, and so and this was just a ton of fun to write. I really had a lot of fun writing it. So that's where it landed.
Yeah, I mean, in that respect, I think then we had a similar mission, because I was trying to make, with my book, Jobs to Be Done, more accessible. But I did take the drier, more academic approach, right? And that's part of my writing style and how I approach things too. But I found it very compelling and accessible. Thinking about somebody maybe new to Jobs to Be Done. I mean, for me, you could see where the Jobs to Be Done pokes its head out in the book. But if you were new to that, I think the context of the story actually brings you right into Jobs to Be Done and back into the story and so forth, so that it weaves this nice accessible format for folks. So thanks for writing the book, by the way.
Yeah, well, and I didn't find your book dry at all, by the way.
Okay.
I really liked it. And I mean, I was obviously someone who's pretty familiar with Jobs to Be Done, but what I loved about it is it was just I love just very clear writing. And I think that's the advantage of your book over even, a book like mine, where because you're getting right to the point, but it's just crystal clear all the way through. Yeah. And it also sorts out, I think, just there's a lot of confusion around Jobs to Be Done. There's a lot of different angles on it floating around in the world. And I like how you kind of situated them all in a way that made sense, so that people could get oriented.
Yeah, that's also part of my style. But to tell you the truth, I had a page limit from my publisher as well too. So I had to go into like reduction sauce mode, where I just stirred things on the pot till it was just 2 paragraphs. Now it's 1 sentence, right? So I think that's why you just get punched in the face when you read my book, because it's just a series of main points, and that was kind of the approach that I was going for. But yours, it's not. It's actually very easy to read through it, because you're in this story and there's character development and scenes and situations and things that might seem superfluous, here, but then later on they come back at the end as well too. Also very, very accessible, but a completely different approach.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, I got one beef to pick with you, if you don't mind.
Please pick away. I was getting ready for it, I'm sure.
You have a chapter. So one of the chapter's titles is Big Data, and then the next chapter is Small Data.
Yeah.
Is Small Data. And I have an issue with that label.
Small data?
Yeah, with small data, because what I like to call it is thick data or thick description. Because when you say small data, you're implying a sample size. Yes, it is a small sample size, but it's thicker. That big data, in my opinion, big data is actually very, very thin. It only tells you, big data tells you one dimension. It doesn't tell you anything about context. It doesn't tell you anything about the why behind it. Whereas thick data, even though your sample size is small, you get all of that context that you need. And in the story, those 2 characters, there's that little kind of like, hey, I'm looking at big data, I'm looking at small data. And I like the term thick data.
Yeah, I like that. I've never heard that term, and I've never thought about it that way, but I totally agree with you. And I mean, for people that might not know what we're talking about, there's a lot of the fun of writing the story was architecting a plot and a set of characters and kind of how they interact in a way that would unfold as a story that hopefully as a story is sort of interesting to follow, but then it also kind of unfolds, what we're trying to teach along the way. And one of the things I was trying, and also to create some conflict and intrigue. So fiction is definitely my preferred genre. And I love to read stories of any kind. but I've never written one before. And I read a couple books about how do you write a novel, how do you write a mystery in particular, because this one has some characteristics of a mystery story, and where the mystery is they have to crack this problem of why they're losing customers, right? Going into the market and solving that mystery using jobs to be done. And so two of the key characters, one is kind of this old school guy who brands himself as a market detective, who goes out and solves market mysteries like this using these jobs to be done techniques and kind of qualitative techniques. And he gets teamed up with this young kind of hotshot computer genius who's into big data and analytics, and they team up to go crack this case. And he asserts that, you know, the big data techniques are at least premature early on in the story because you need small data. And what I meant by that is, I think it's the same thing that Jim means, which is you go in and you don't try to get a big sample size right away, but you interview a handful of people and try to get really deep. And I like that word, Jim, thick. And this idea of, you know, go and get your small data before big data. Right. And it's a real, you know, it's a real challenge. Like one of my clients right now is one of the big social media companies, and we're helping them to figure out how to implement jobs, and they want it for precisely this reason, which is that their big data techniques don't feel sufficiently thick, although they didn't use those words. But it's really antithetical to their culture and way of doing things, right? Because they want to go straight for the big sample size for statistically meaningful scale and so on. But I like that way of putting it, Jim.
Okay, great. Good for that. Hey, do you know the book called The Statue in the Stone? Have you read that one?
I have not, but I will write it down.
That was written by our friend Scott Burleson here, who's on the call as well too. Also a really great book on jobs to be done.
Well, I can't believe I've never heard of that. I will definitely buy it right away.
There you go.
That's cool.
Yeah. Oh, there you go. Danny's got Danny's you owe Danny a beer, Scott, for that little promo there.
Commission check will be in the mail.
Yeah. We had Scott on an episode 2 episodes ago. Scott was our guest there too. Also a fellow author here.
Oh, that's awesome. I thought I had heard of all the books on jobs, but I am gonna buy it.
That's what I said about your book too. I thought, I know all the books.
I know.
And somebody recommended your book to me as well. Have you read his book, Scott? Have you read David's book?
I have just ordered it. I'm fascinated by the premise. I'm sitting on questions, trying not to ask too many questions, but I am very excited to get into it.
Yeah. All right. So I think with that, Elaine, thanks so much, David. Let's take some audience questions here. I just introduced Scott, but I know some other folks here probably have some burning questions as well too. So thanks so much for that. Should I start left to right, Elaine, do you think?
Yes, but I'm going to reorder things just a little bit. We have one question from Andrea, who I think should come up and ask.
Yeah. Hey,
and then the second question is from Juan. So I'll get those organized for you.
And you guys might know Andrea Hill from our last episode of Jobs to be Done Untangled. She was a technical reviewer on my book. Are you there, Andrea?
I am. I'm not going on video this morning.
Oh, I can't hear her. Is she speaking?
Yes, but the audio is really low.
Okay. I'm going to read your question, Andrea. Love the comment about how orgs start to structure towards internal efficiency rather than customer problems, which leads to disruptions. What are some examples of orgs who have structured better? Do you have examples of that, David?
That is a great question. So I think the way I would think about it, and I'll come back to the direct question in a second, but I would think about it as how do you, because I wouldn't necessarily go straight to structure as the solution, right? So, a lot of our work at Innosight is about, so let me back up. So there are a bunch of root causes for the innovator's dilemma, right? And some of them relate to structure, but some of them relate to culture, some relate to strategy and how strategy gets articulated, how it gets developed. Some relate to metrics and incentives, some relate to processes. You know, and so a lot of our work is about how do you evolve an organization's capabilities so that it can continuously innovate new sources of growth, while at the same time, you know, strengthening, extending, maximizing the value of the core business it's in today, right? It's doing those two things at the same time. And typically companies are optimized for the second thing, right? Just optimizing their core, growing it as well as they can. They're not very good at creating the new things, and they're really bad at doing them both at the same time, right? Because they're, and so, you know, if you think about jobs to be done is the means to an end, right? So it's a tool, or it's part of the solution. But if you're trying, if the goal of jobs to be done is to enable you, is to be able to create better products, services, businesses that solve real customer problems better, and you want to build the capability to do that repeatedly, right? And then manage the whole set of things you have going on together as a portfolio. You have to think about things like changing the way that you pursue innovation so that it embeds jobs to be done from the very beginning all the way to the end, right? And that's not so much about org structure, that's about your process and tool kit for doing innovation. It's about the metrics that you use along the way to measure progress towards your innovation. So that's like one thing you have to do is on your processes. You have to think about how you allocate resources to projects along that innovation pipeline, and how you do that for different types of innovation, for things within your core as well as the new, because resources come from one pool, right? So you have to be able to balance investment in the new as well as your core business, right? So you change your processes, you have to change how you allocate resources. You very often have to change how you articulate what your strategy is, and even how you develop strategy to do that in a more customer-centric way. And you probably have to change aspects of your culture, how people behave, what they think is valuable in terms of how they spend their time, the performance incentives they have, and so on. And all of that, I would say, comes before structure. Right? So if you really wanted to implement jobs to be done, I would think about all of those levers first. You know, I think some companies that do that really well, you know, Intuit comes to mind, and I know they're a big champion of jobs to be done internally, but it isn't just because they have this. It's not just because of how they're organized, although they are organized in a way where they think about pursuing new things separately than pursuing the core. But they've thought about that whole system of things and how it has to work together.
Yeah, I talk about Intuit in the introduction to my book, because they're actually a customer of ours here at Mural. So I've been working with them for about 5 years, particularly teams like around their Innovation Catalyst program, which is quite widespread, which really gives that culture of innovation throughout the organization at Intuit. So that's very often an example that I would throw out also as the answer here to David. So that's interesting. You kind of gravitated towards the same example as I usually do. But thanks for that. I'm going to move along just so we can get some other voices in here and have some other questions. Hey, Wolfram, grüß dich. You want to ask your question?
Hi, yeah, sure. But I was not, next one wasn't Andrea next one?
No,
we just did Andrea's question.
Yeah, and then Juan is in queue as well. But I
Okay.
thought that your question was there was a little bit more of a natural next step to this.
Okay,
one.
yeah, so yeah, fine for me. So my question would be, I mean, I guess most of us know that situation. I just read it. What's the approach to convince the stakeholders, for example, in that big social media company, or it can happen in any other company, that to convince them that jobs to be done is, I don't know, better, or at least something you also should try out compared to the usual typical big data you get from whatever product usage and so on. And with jobs to be done, you also get data in the end. And how do you compare or utilize it compared to the other data that stakeholders like to use You understand what I mean?
I do. Yeah. Yeah. These are really great questions. On the first one, so for that particular company, I'm gratified to say that the chief product officer read my new book and he called me up. Or he actually.
So you need to write a book, Wolfram. That's the answer.
Yeah. Well, no, but think about it this way. So again, you know, and I know, Jim, you probably don't like this famous quote: "People don't want a quarter-inch drill; they want a quarter-inch hole," because people don't want a quarter-inch hole either. But jobs to be done is a quarter-inch drill, right? It's a solution. So ask yourself the question: what's the job to be done for jobs to be done? Right. And that Wolfram, I would say, is my answer. Is there's a real unmet need or unsatisfied job to be done that jobs to be done fills, right? And whether or not they agree jobs to be done is the answer or not, they still have that unmet need. Organizations do. And so I'm sure between all of the brains on this call, we could articulate a pretty full list of what those unsolved needs are. For this social media company, for example, right? They're basically a software development company, right? And they believe that the way that they develop products, and in this case, it was somebody who's on the executive team that is a sponsor of this and a believer of this. So that helps a lot, right? Like if you've got somebody senior who's behind all of this. But the gap that he saw and still sees is they tend to develop products. And I think this happens in a lot of technology companies where they focus a lot on kind of output metrics, and you know they're very internally focused metrics and metrics around membership rates and utilization and how long people stick around on the site. They're all metrics that are disconnected from the value that's being created for the customer, and so they end up just churning on things, and they've been incredibly successful because they just throw out stuff and see what sticks, right? As opposed to having a thoughtful hypothesis around why any one of those things could stick, and they feel like they're reaching the limits of how much they can grow using that approach. Right. So one job is to make your products and your product development process more responsive to what people really want and need. Right. And shockingly, there's no other solution out there. Right. I mean, a lot of tech companies have the same problem. I think the whole discipline of product management largely suffers from the same problem. So that's one example. You know, I think another job to be done for the jobs to be done approach is, you know, helping you to stave off disruption to your core business. That's a job that resonates with very senior executives, and most of our clients are business leaders, so they're, you know, P&L leadership teams. And this concept is so sticky to them. Like they love this idea because and I thought a lot about that question of why, because when I first heard about jobs to be done, I thought it was not really that interesting. I was like, oh, well, that's just another way to talk about customer needs. Like that's what I thought initially, but I've seen the power of it as a reframe for very senior people consistently for over 10 years. Like they absolutely love it. And I think it's because it also helps them understand the dynamics of what's happening in the world around them. Like it actually does explain the causality behind why people get disrupted. And it helps you understand why big incumbents are struggling against, brand new startups with far less resources. So from a senior leader perspective, a job to be done for jobs to be done is to help them better understand the competitive dynamics in the market and come up with strategic responses that are more likely to be effective. But I'm sure we can make a long list of them, but that's where I would go if I was trying to convince somebody. I would try to get them to agree to what their problems were that we know jobs to be done can solve, and go there.
I think we need to do more with that point, Elaine, in our courses, matching the job of jobs to be done with the jobs to be done framework as well too. All right, that's great. I see Wolfram nodding his head a little bit. Was that suffice, Wolfram, as an answer? It was a pretty good answer, I thought.
Thanks. Interesting thought. I mean, that's what the book is. That's easy. So they read your book, so you are already.
Well, that's why I say you got to write a book, so you can just walk in a room, put the book on the table.
I just have some slides to show around.
You have some slides. They're good slides. I've seen them, Wolfram. They're good
that's
slides.
a great start.
Yeah, it is.
Okay, thanks, David. Thanks.
Okay. All right. Now we're going to Juan now, I think, right, Elaine?
Yes.
Got time for a couple more questions.
Yeah, we have one from Juan and one from Scott in the queue. And if anybody else wants to post a couple more.
Hey, Juan, do you want to read your question for us?
Sure, I can read it. Thank you. Well, first of all, looking forward to read these books. Interesting what you guys are talking, and well, my question basically is, well, I've seen that the jobs to be done method is very powerful, you know, in the B2B, in the business to consumer context. I've seen a lot of examples and all that, but in the business to business context, you're dealing sometimes with multiple stakeholders, and probably there's like different dimensions that sometimes I don't know if the jobs to be done can you know show. So maybe what recommendations can you give when applying jobs to be done interviews in a B2B context? Do you guys have any like good practices or an example?
Yeah,
you guys a little bit more context. Maybe right now fundamentally I'm leading a research where we're trying to figure out you know, in this new sort of post-pandemic era, or you know, 2 years now from the pandemic, why are companies hiring office spaces for? Like what are their jobs to be done in that context? Because you're seeing a lot of companies that are reducing their space, but they are also growing, but on a remote space. Like their companies are doing great, but they are hiring people. So the question is, why do you want an office space for right now? So kind of you know, giving more context to this question.
You got any thoughts, David?
Oh yeah, definitely. So so a lot of the work that we've done, I'd say applying jobs to be done, it's probably been about 50-50 with B2B versus B2C clients. And one of the early projects I worked on at Innovator was for Medtronic, and we wrote about it a little bit in Competing Against Luck, so I can talk a little bit about it. And they're a B2B company, right? They sell medical devices to, you know, healthcare systems, for example. And so in terms of a reference, so in the story that I wrote, you know, I had to think pretty hard about what the fictional company would be that was having a problem that jobs would come in and solve. And I went through 4 or 5 different industries and fictional companies before I landed on the one I did. I had some really terrible ideas. The one that I ended up landing on was a fictitious chain of coffee shops that was, you know, had been growing rapidly in the Northeast and was on the verge of doing an IPO. And then their sales started to taper off and decline right then. And the mystery that they have to solve is, well, what's actually going on in the market and what can they do to reverse that decline? And I chose that industry finally because you know, you have to answer the question, well, why do people hire a coffee shop? Like what jobs they're trying to get done? And it's something everybody can relate to, right? Because we all go into coffee shops, and it's actually quite a rich set of answers, right? There's a lot of different reasons you might go in and hire a coffee shop on a given day. And it was a B2C example, right? But intentionally, because it was also simpler, it's more intuitive for the average person to relate to. But in the second part of the book, which is the sort of shorter nonfiction, you know, Cliff Notes version of the ideas themselves, there is a section on what it looks like for B2B, like how is it different? And And there I talk about, well, what if your customer, what if you weren't trying to understand the jobs of consumers that come into your coffee shop, but your client was the coffee shop chain, and you were trying to understand the jobs of the institution. But I kind of lay out what I think the differences are between B2B and B2C. So that's a good, I guess, succinct reference of what I'm about to say. And I think this is a place where more work could be done for sure on B2B. And I'm working on an article about it, just to lay out at least a stake in the ground. I'm sure it's incomplete, but the way I think about it is, if you're selling to a company, you're selling to not just one person, but what we might think of as a decision-making system, right? Where there might be, say in the case of Medtronic, selling to a healthcare system, 5 or 6 different people in different roles in the organization they're selling to that are going to have some say in whether or not they hire Medtronic's products versus some other organization products. And we developed in that project, and this was about 15 years ago, this idea of a decision-making system, right? So that the first thing is who's the set of stakeholders who either are going to influence or choose to hire your product, or are going to need to use it somehow, right? Like, so they have they're going to be affected by that choice. And let's say there's like 5 people, for example. In Medtronic, it might be obviously the procurement person's always there. But in their case, since they sold, premium, but we were serving their heart arrhythmia division, which, so Medtronic invented pacemakers and things like implantable defibrillators, and they have the kind of premium technology version of those products in the market. So the specialist cardiologists who stakeholder, right, in the decision-making system, you might actually have the CFO in the mix because it's a really expensive purchase. So there's 4 or 5 different people, and so you have to identify the decision-making system, how they make the decision, and then you have to understand the jobs of each of those people, right? So you'd want to talk to each of those people, right? That you'd interview them in the same way you would interview, a consumer, and you want to understand their jobs. And then this is, I think, a new thing, but what I assert in my book is they each have 2 types of jobs that are different. Okay, so they have jobs, and this is particular to B2B, they have jobs to be done on behalf of the organization that relate to their role in it. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a second. Then they have their personal jobs related to their role in the organization. So what do I mean by that? Well, a CFO, because he or she is a CFO, has jobs to be done for the org, like, make sure we don't run out of cash, or, manage the risk associated with our cash flows, or, make sure we're adhering to all the regulatory standards. So and those are jobs the organization needs to solve that the CFO in particular cares about. A CEO might have different jobs, like, I need to build a strong leadership team under me, or I want to make sure we build a strong culture, or I need to communicate my vision or the company's strategy to the market analysts effectively, right? Those are jobs of the organization, but the CEO has them. Like that person in particular cares. Other people do too, but right, the procurement person, which is the bane of my existence, since I do B2B sales, is they have jobs to be done, like, squeeze as much money out of our vendors as we can, and so on. So they each have, in the Medtronic case, that specialist cardiologist has jobs like, I certainly want to get the best devices for my patient, but if they're in a elite research institution, they might want to have the cutting edge technology because they always want to be demonstrating to the world that their organization is on the cutting edge. So they all have totally different jobs, but they're role specific, right? That's one type of job. Then each of those people also has the second type of job, which is their personal jobs that relate to their career. So a CEO might have personal jobs like, I want to leave a legacy, or the procurement person has a job of, well, I don't want to get fired. I want to make my boss happy. I want to advance in my career, or, right. So those are more like personal jobs. And so I think, coming back to your question finally directly, I would think about, as you're designing a research program for a B2B client, you want to identify the stakeholders in that system. And then as you explore things, right, and all of those things like social, functional, emotional, and circumstance, like those are still relevant to understand. You would also probe on these two different types of jobs. And then I guess the last thing I'll say is there's also a parallel. A lot of the concepts that we think about for jobs in a consumer context, there's a parallel for organizations like circumstance, for example. So, in my book, I assert that demographic variables are a category of circumstance, right? Like your financial status and your, say, your family status, or what have you, where you live, your living situation. There are parallels to that for companies, right? You can think about the financial status of an organization, or where it is, or what industry it's in, and where it is in its evolution, its growth pathway. There are parallels there as well. So sorry, that was a bit long-winded, but hopefully.
No, it's great. I love it. I get that question a lot. How do you apply anything that's in my book or the workshops to a B2B context? In fact, sometimes I get that question. It's already wrapped in the assumption that it doesn't apply. Like, oh, yes. Great. Thanks for that, Jim. But this doesn't apply to B2B. And that's then right. It's a similar answer that I give, but I think you gave even a little bit more texture there. And I'm really looking forward to that article where you lay out some of these differences, because it's a question that comes up a lot, and we need to address it, I think, as a field.
Well, and that's why I put it in the second section, because I could hear that question coming, right. Like, oh, well, this is just for, for B2C, but right. Yeah.
You get that question a lot too, Scott?
I do. And by the way, the answering of the question perfectly illustrates the value of jobs to be done, because you have this language you can use to describe the environment.
Right.
And with that, maybe I'll just transition into my question.
There you go. Thanks, Scott.
I'm a consultant as well. And so when I first read the milkshake story, I mean, it just really changed my life. It certainly changed my career, changed the way I think about everything. And now working with clients, I want to have access to that language, jobs to be done language, as I work with them and their business to unfold that complexity. But I've noticed that there's a small percentage of folks, they see the usefulness right away, and that's great. But it seems like there's a larger group that it begins to sound academic and difficult, and I could just see them closing off. And so my question for you is, by the way, just when I listen even now to Dr. Christensen on YouTube, I mean, I've heard the stories over and over, but I can listen to them over and over, almost like I'm listening to my grandfather's story.
Yeah.
So my very practical and selfish question is, so, what advice do you have, and what's worked for you in just explaining it to laymen so that they don't get this overwhelmed, or this really sounds too academic?
That's another really great question. So I thought about, this may not be exactly the same question, but I thought about the question of why is jobs to be done so powerful a lot? Like I thought about that a lot. Like, what is it? And what's special about it, right? Because that's kind of the question before your question, right? Like, why would you even bother to make a case that this is useful? It's like, why is it so useful, right? And I think the best answers I can, and I've seen it, and I know you've all seen it too, right? And you've experienced it yourself, like you just said. You watched, you listened to the Gospel of Clay, and now you're a convert like the rest of us, and I've seen it again with CEOs of Fortune 10 companies. I've seen Clay explain it to them. I've seen it presented in countless workshops, and it's really compelling with really smart, really sophisticated people who don't have time to waste. And so why, right? And the best answer I can give is that I think it, and this doesn't answer your question, I'll come back to your question directly in a second, but is that it's firstly, it's a really useful language for precisely articulating what otherwise are fuzzy concepts of like customer value and customer needs. There's a sharpness to the word job that that immediately anchors you to what it is you really want to understand about somebody, right? That the word need and value and all these other words don't have. So it's a super useful language, and I talk a lot about this in my book, that you need there's a lot of things you could go learn about somebody, about a customer or a company that you want to serve as a customer. Only some of those things are going to help you help them. Right? And jobs to be done is firstly a sharp set of things that you're looking to understand. So it's this idea of a language. It's also a language that everybody can get immediately because it has a metaphor embedded in it. Like jobs is a metaphor. We're using it as a metaphor, like you hire products like you hire people, and that makes it more memorable and more sticky. And then the other thing is, I think it's this really powerful reframing mechanism where you're kind of inward focused and you're caught up in your own success formula, products, business model, whatever, and it reframes you immediately out of that into a whole different, it's almost magic, the explanatory power of this reframe. So that's why I think it's so powerful. In terms of how you get people to see that, which is what you're asking here, I think I don't know if this is my best answer, but so the first thing is I would try to connect it to what problems it solves for them, first of all. Like, first of all, before you say, I've got this 1/4-inch drill called jobs to be done, like get on the same page with them as to what their problem is they need to solve with it, right? And get them to acknowledge that's a problem, which 100% for certain it is. And then stories, right? So can you, that's what Clay's milkshake is. It's, whether it's true or not, whether or not it's like become sort of an urban legend. I think of it more as parable almost now, but it's, explaining stories, ideally ones they can relate to, and also applying it to their context, right? Like say, well, here's, if, because if you can get them to admit they have this problem and then show how this solution can solve it, both with outside examples and an example from their company, then you can usually convince them.
Yeah, great answer. Interesting question, Scott, because I would probably ask that of you as well, too. So I'm wondering what you thought about that answer.
Well, I love it. And you know what? No matter what our product is, we're all guilty of falling in love with it and not seeing the perspective of our customers. And what irony, when our product is jobs to be done, we fall in love with it so much so that we're pushing it without taking the time to understand the jobs of our customers. There's some irony there. And it's a
coffee table book about coffee tables.
It's a coffee table book about coffee tables.
A similar thing.
Yeah.
I have the distinct advantage that I'm not a jobs to be done consultant. In fact, I mentioned that in my book. And I have had people come to me and I say, well, maybe jobs to be done is not the right framework for you at this point in time. And I'm able to do that because I'm not trying to sell drills. I just want people to understand the framework, right? So,
well, yeah, and we're not either, actually.
Right, exactly.
We're really about helping with the job to be done of how to and jobs to be done as a tool in the jobs, but that's right. And originally it even this I have another article. I have like 500 articles I'm working on, but there's another one that I'm serious about is sort of what are the jobs to be done for jobs to be done. And when I first started working on this recent book, I thought I was writing a book about how to do jobs to be done. And then I had that insight, which is, well, why, I was trying to think like, who would hire this book? What's problems it going to solve for somebody? And that's where I sort of realized, well, it's not really about jobs. It's about something else. It's about, yeah.
Yeah, great. Well, thanks so much for that. I think we're gonna have to end it there. We pretty much used up the whole hour, Elaine.
Yeah, we did. We're right at the top of the next hour. So I think it's probably time to wrap up. John had a nice comment in the chat just to follow up on David. Just do it and don't tell people the name of it.
I like that. That's clever. I like that. That's a good idea.
Thanks for that, John. Yeah, thanks again, David, so much for being our guest today. It was fantastic to have you on the show.
Yeah, thank you,
Thanks
David.
for
Really
having me. It was
appreciate it.
fun.
Great in-depth answers. Really wonderful. Stay safe out there, everyone. We'll be back in January. Keep an eye out for a follow-up email with some resources and a date for some of our 2022 events.
2022 events, yeah. And we're recording this, so we put these up on our YouTube channel as well too, so that if you have friends that might be interested too, they can see it there. But it was great to see familiar faces, and welcome to everybody new. We do this about once a month. So thanks for joining us on Jobs to Be Done Untangled.
Yeah, nice to meet you all. Thanks for having me. Have a good holiday.
All right, everybody.
Thanks,
Thank you.
David.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.